Hello everyone. So as we're getting into argumentative writing, this lecture is really breaking down the different elements of argumentation, specifically the framework for planning or analyzing an argument. So as we begin looking at examples before we start making on our own, we know how we can go about that process to make the overall argument more effective. So that process, we're going to be focusing specifically on the acronym PACES, so PACES. So this acronym really sets up the different elements in order in terms of what we would want to consider as we're breaking down and of course as we're planning to create our own argument. Because of course it's really important to note that arguments just aren't created. Oftentimes there's a lot of work, there's a lot of planning consideration that goes into it and to ensure that the purpose is fulfilled properly. If we were to just write an argument without that forethought, typically we wouldn't have the time to really gather our thoughts. And of course, we wouldn't necessarily be presenting it with our audience in mind. Because of course, when we think about planning for an argument, or analyzing an argument, the audience is the most important group that you want to consider, especially because for argumentative writing, the argument is for that audience. That is the sole purpose. So you just need to have all of that information at the beginning to make sure you're doing that properly or to assess that an author is doing that properly. So the first part of this acronym is the P, which of course stands for project. So that is really all of the work that's done in the brainstorming, in the planning for the argument itself. So when we think about that project, it's really giving that author or that writer some time to really think what he, she, or they want to be arguing about, especially in cases where you're presenting an academic argument and you need to figure out what stance you want to take. And of course, you can also figure out within this section the different claims or counter arguments that exist to help you build that argument. So the project is really where we're thinking about the reasons why the opposition might disagree with us so that we can address those concerns with our own claims and counter their arguments to make our own argument more effective. And of course, this is also where we're identifying the variety of evidence we can use. So as we're conducting that writing process, we're moving forward, we have that already and we can figure out what evidence works best for which claim, and of course, what evidence and what claims would be best to persuade that target audience. Because if we change the audience, those choices may change. So when you think of what we do and what we would look at for this stage, for our planning or research, we would research about the subject. So really to understand the debate surrounding the topic so you are as informed as possible. So really, as we're analyzing a text, we also want to see how informed that writer is. If it seems that they didn't do a lot of research into that topic, then that might affect how credible we find their argument. In the planning and research stage, that's also when the research is conducted to figure out who that audience is, specifically their background and demographics, because if we think about that, their age, gender, education, beliefs, occupations, all of those things can change their specific biases and, of course, their thoughts and of how we can appeal to them differently. So we really need to understand that audience, understand where they're coming from, what they believe, so that we can better appeal to them as we're constructing our argument. Which brings us to the A from this acronym, which is the argument itself. So this is also known as the main assertion. So this is the stance that the writer is taking, and they're trying to persuade the audience to agree with that main assertion, that main stance. So we do have certain characteristics that we look for an argument. Arguments must be about a debatable issue or topic. If it's not debatable, then it's not an argument. We need to have some opposition. We need to have somebody to persuade. We must take a concrete stance. You cannot argue for both sides of the argument. That would really fall more into expository writing. And the argument, if we think of it, it can be explicitly stated, like in a thesis statement, but it also could be implicit, meaning that it is implied based on the claims that are made and based on the evidence that is presented. And depending on the argument you're making, an explicit or implicit argument made assertion can have varying benefits, which we will look at further in this semester. Now, the C in the acronym PACES stands for claims. So these are also referred to as sub-assertions. These specifically are the reasons that you're giving to build towards that main argument, that main assertion. So really, it's the different statements, the different more provable points that you can make that can help to persuade that audience. If we want to compare claims to this argument itself, claims are more specific, they're provable, while that argument may be a little bit more general. We can't necessarily provide evidence for that argument because it would just be a lot of different things. So claims really help to organize that thought process and make it a little bit easier to follow. Another thing to note with claims is, just like with the argument itself, they can be explicitly or implicitly presented based on how the paragraph is organized. So that specifically is whether its paragraph is using deductive or inductive reasoning. And of course, there are varying benefits. So for a claim that is explicitly stated at the beginning of the paragraph, that can be really beneficial because there's no question as to what is the point that the audience should be taking away. So as they look at the evidence, as they look at that paragraph progressing, they know what they should be focusing on. However, certain claims are implicitly presented when they have to kind of build or kind of pull the audience into agreeing with that claim. So these are claims that the audience might be very kind of against in the very beginning. So by having it implied through the evidence, you can reason with them more into seeing that point instead of having them fight you on it when you state it explicitly. And when we think about claims, we have three types of claims. So we have claims of fact. So this is a statement about something being true or false. It's really important to note that claims of fact aren't necessarily always in fact factual, because of course facts can be relative depending on the perspective. What's true for one person cannot be untrue for another. So claims of fact specifically means that the author is just stating it's a fact, and then they have to prove with evidence that that statement is in fact true. Claims of value, on the other hand, those are statements that something is right or wrong or good or bad. So if you think about a value and what that means, it's more subjective. So they're trying to have the audience view that specific subject in a certain way, typically tied with more emotion. And our final claim is a claim of policy. So this is probably the claim type that's used the most infrequently because it's really based on the argument that is being made. Because claims of policy, it's arguing that something should or shouldn't be done, and it usually centers on rules or laws that dictate and control a situation. So certain arguments, there aren't rules or laws connected to that. So in those arguments, then we wouldn't necessarily see claims of policy. So the E in PACES is evidence. So the evidence is the support that's presented to convince the audience to believe or agree with each claim as well as the overall argument. So when you think about evidence as a whole within argumentative writing, it is really important to have a variety of evidence to support your claims, primarily because the more variety you have, the stronger the argument comes across, as well as you are able to specifically appeal to the audience in different ways to really get them to support and be successful in achieving that purpose. So evidence should come from credible sources, or they should be presented credibly. And of course, when we think about this, they need to be relevant for each claim and the overall argument. So if evidence is not relevant, then that can be really problematic, and it can really hurt the overall effectiveness and credibility of your argument. We do have a lot of common types of evidence. This list is by no means complete, but when we typically think about evidence, we think about examples we use to illustrate our points, statistics or data, which is more quantifiable, so that would be really logical for audiences, studies, personal anecdotes, historical or legal precedent, which if we think about precedent, precedent is a comparison between something that happened within history or a ruling on a legal case. So when we use precedent as evidence, we're comparing that situation, and we're saying because this choice was made back then, or this ruling was made for this similar case, the same choice should be made now, or we should have the same ruling. So it's a different type of comparison. We have cause and effect analysis, we have comparisons themselves, which could be focusing on the similarities or differences, and we of course have authoritative quotes. So quoting people who are experts or have firsthand experience with that topic that you are arguing about can be really effective. And the evidence really helps us to build into the last part of our acronym, which is the S, which stands for strategies. So when we think about strategies with argumentation, these are the little choices we make as we're writing our argument, as we're putting it together. Because of course, when we're taking that project, we're taking the argument, the claims, the evidence, we need to figure out what order we need to place them in. We need to figure out how we want to organize our sentences and the specific tone that we want to use. So that really builds into the strategies. Rhetorical strategies are how we put that argument together in order to make it persuasive for that target audience. So when we think about rhetorical strategies, typically they build appeals to what we call the Aristotelian appeals. So that stems from Aristotle and his theories surrounding argumentation, specifically how people are persuaded in 3 different ways. So people are persuaded or they make choices based on emotions. So that would be the appeal to pathos when you're trying to make your audience feel for that situation. So whether that is feeling sad, empathetic, frustrated, angry, using the emotions for your audience can be really effective in getting them to agree with you. Then we have the appeal to logos, which is logic. So by presenting the argument as logical, as reasonable, you're presenting that it would be unreasonable or not logical for the audience to disagree with your points. And lastly, which arguably may be the most important, is the appeal to ethos, which is really credibility. So when you think about credibility, how that author is presenting him or herself as trustworthy. Because of course, if we don't trust the author, if we don't trust the claims or evidence that he or she is presenting, then we're going to be less likely to agree with the overall argument, no matter how well it may be presented. And of course, we have different rhetorical strategies types. We have rhetorical strategies that focus on organization and structure, as well as rhetorical strategies that focus on word choices and tone. But we also have rhetorical strategies that are really focused on how evidence is presented, because rhetorical strategies can be different from each individual sentence that's making up a paragraph and then building towards that overall essay. We will be talking more about rhetorical strategies moving forward once we get into specifically analyzing and identifying individual rhetorical strategies. So if we want to visualize all of this together, we can look at an image like this. So if we see the project is the beginning stage, so that's going into the argument, And we can see how the argument is laid out and it builds towards the different claims and the different evidence. The strategy is just putting it all together. Just a note about this visual, arguments can, of course, have more than 3 claims. This is just an abbreviated visual to show that relationship.